Leesburg National Center Chorus. The work that they're going to present to you is the fruit of work that they do every morning, about 10 minutes or so of work every morning. We found that the best way to begin the day was with beauty, and I suggest that everyone strive for this. The piece that we're going to do first is we're going to do a short little warm-up piece, and then we're going to launch into 3 sections of Mozart's Requiem. I do not want to detract from the profound impression that this piece has on the human heart by going through the many wonderful and fascinating details of the way that Mozart constructed this piece. Suffice it to say that it was based on a creative breakthrough. And I will simply point out 2 aspects of that breakthrough in terms of the way he sets it up. The first is the way he uses what is termed inversion, where a small statement is taken and turned in a different way, turned upside down, turned backwards, and in this way a problem or a paradox is created in a simple form. Rather than showing you that with Mozart's piece, what I decided to do is to take a shorter piece that we also use every morning in a warm-up, a piece written by J.S. Bach, which is specifically based just on inversions. And let me demonstrate the way that will work. First, what I will have is the sopranos simply sing the opening of the little canon. So you hear that. You play Soldo. That is repeated by all of the other voices, but not at the same time. It's done in polyphony, and each voice successively enters and does the same thing on a different, but from a different starting point. Just to give you one example, let me have the altos do their line just a little bit. Now we will do all 4. But that's not all. Now let's turn this little idea upside down. Let's hear the basses sing the same thing upside down. Now we'll put that together. with the Requiem, I simply want to point out one aspect, which you will notice in all of the work. I simply want to point out the way that the opening works in the Requiem. Requiem, by the way, means rest in peace. This is a requiem for the dead. However, Mozart's Requiem is very, very much for the living. The way it starts, Marcia, could you please play just the opening line there? Oh. Okay. That's fine. Okay. The opening, you notice that there's an pa, and then the next the other voice enters. It goes pa, dum, like that. Play that again. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Mozart could have written that simply with pa on the downbeat. Try that just on the downbeat. Right. He didn't do that. The shift is very similar to the shift between the two statues that Lyndon LaRouche showed in his presentation. On the left-hand side, the pre-classical, which was stiff and straight. And on the right-hand side, the one with the shift, where everything is off balance. And that's precisely the nature of Mozart's breakthrough in this piece. Now, since we don't have an orchestra, and since the opening of this piece is very important for the whole thing, and we were frustrated because we wanted to hear the orchestra, we decided to become the orchestra. And so I taught the chorus the opening parts, which were written for 2 basset horns. Those are low clarinets, and 2 bassoons. But instead, what we're going to have that done is by the sopranos, altos, tenors, and basses. The entire piece is encapsulated in these few short measures. And I hope just by singing these, you can at least get some idea of the passion behind the breakthrough that Mozart made when he did this piece, which it was the last piece he wrote. And of course, he did not even complete it. He wrote it. He died in the middle of composing it. So let us do this opening passage, and then what I will do is we'll start over again with just the orchestra, and we will sing the whole Requiem section. And then after that, we're going to sing 2 other selections. One is the Lacrimosa, and the third one is the Sanctus.
Maddie, Distinguished University Professor of Music at the University of Michigan School of Music.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be with you. I've just finished 3 days of seeming non-stop activity with the National Opera Association convention here in Washington over the Marriott. So if I appear a bit brain dead, please forgive me. The introduction made it appear, at least to me, as though I had some expertise in composition. Nothing could be further from the truth. I've spent my life as a singer of other people's compositions, and it's in that capacity and as a music educator that I come before you this evening. In part to plead for the continuance of music education in the public schools of this country, to plead for a reawakening of respect for the importance of a musical education that is grounded in classical principles, to plead for a reawakening of respect for the power of language, be it sung or spoken. I was watching CBS Sunday Morning this past Sunday and noted that Ron Carter had received a prestigious award, jazz, as a jazz musician. And I was gratified to see the focus on Carter's classical training. He's a phenomenal musician, but he had studied all of his young life the cello in hopes of becoming an orchestral musician. And when he graduated from college and found that that avenue was not open to him because few, if any, African Americans were being hired as orchestral musicians, he decided to use his musical talents and his training in the field of jazz and has become a preeminent musician. But it was his classical training that prepared him to be the great bassist and composer that he is today. I was very fortunate when I grew up in Detroit to grow up in a city that had one of the best systems of music education in this country. It was a combination of the musical education that we began to receive from the first grade through the 12th. That training combined with the rich cultural heritage of the neighborhoods in which we grew up that produced some of the leading classical and popular musicians in this country. Unfortunately, that system of music education has been deracinated because of a lack of public funding people expect the tree to flower when it's been uprooted. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. To expect to produce musicians who function beyond the level of competence and expect their expertise to appear miraculously as young adults when the seeds have not been planted and nourished from childhood. We in this country live a kind of lobotomized existence with the arts. In pre-literate societies, what we refer to as the arts formed part and parcel of the very act of living. In pre-literate societies, there are certain fundamental, essential acts that take place every day that cannot be put in motion without music, dance, what some might call drama, and the visual arts being called into force. And that's been the way of life ever since human beings came into existence. Unfortunately, along the way, somewhere, visual arts, music, drama, dance became separated out from this daily act of living. They no longer became holistic life force. They became objets d'art, which were placed on walls, on the stage, put in a physical position to be admired from a distance rather than participated in. And when they were designated as objets d'art, they also became expendable, no longer a part of the act of living, at least in the minds of many in society. Thus, we find ourselves in a struggle today to convince people to look beyond the so-called bottom line when it comes to school budgets and recognize that the arts remain an essential to the development of well-balanced human beings. We see this struggle played out almost every day of our lives. As I was listening to the choir here, I was thinking how wonderful it would be if this happened every morning in Congress. Music has a way of turning the Tower of Babel into a place of harmony and understanding. At the Legacy Awards banquet last night, Everett Lee, African-American conductor who is enjoying a distinguished career in Scandinavia and has enjoyed a distinguished career here in the United States and in South America, Germany, all over the world, shared a vignette with us of a performance that he'd conducted in Europe in which this was an operatic performance in which one singer was singing in German, another singing in Italian, another singing in a different language. This quite often happens when singers have to come in to substitute for someone who's ill. And in spite of this difference in the languages in which these singers were singing, there was a common bond which still produced something of harmony and beauty and substance, and that was music. And it's that common bond that human beings all share. We've heard and we hear again and again that music is the basic language of humankind. And I believe that, well, you might say as a professional musician I'm a bit prejudiced. All right, I won't argue that. But I do believe it because when I walk into a nursery where there are a number of infants, I hear sounds that I term musical. And it's amazing to me how infants always seem to communicate, to express themselves in such a way that becomes communication between them. It's the language we start off with. And as demonstrated here this evening, and as I've seen demonstrated so often in my career, it's the language that we continue to speak, no matter what our political beliefs, no matter what our religious beliefs. When people get together and make music, all of the good things that human existence should be about, all those good things happen. There's cooperation, there's a sharing of energy that molds individual souls into one. All of the ideal things are made manifest. It would be wonderful to see that acknowledged from kindergarten on throughout the process of education. One of the speakers yesterday was saying that at the University of Cincinnati Conservatory, they lost a number of years ago 2 subjects that he would dearly love to see reintroduced into the curriculum. One was a course in physiology, and the other a course in elocution. Most people don't know what elocution is. I mentioned to Dennis Speed some time ago that one of the things that made the late Dr. Martin Luther King so powerful was the fact that he, to my way of thinking, sang when he spoke. And it was this singing legato that carried his message all the more deeply into the souls of those who heard him. The power of speech, the joy of the taste of words, carrying a message that needs to be heard. We in America don't understand that. Young people don't understand the power of language. And I, as a singer, feel privileged to be gifted with not only the power of the language of words, but the power of the language of music. Another reason why music should not be withdrawn from the education of young people is because of the fact that it is a language. It trains a way of thinking, of perceiving the world. And to deny children that development is criminal. I lose no opportunity when speaking with my colleagues to urge them to speak for the reintroduction of the holistic life force of a musical education can bring to the classroom. It's not a matter of producing professional musicians, not at all. But it is a matter of introducing human beings to the necessity to remain in touch with their original voices that expressed to their parents without words their joy, their pain, their stress, their sadness, before the acquisition of words, and expressed it in terms that were, one might argue, are more powerful than words can ever be. If you've ever raised an infant, you know what I'm talking about. When my son was an infant, I could hear him all over the neighborhood when he cried. And I told my colleagues at the Metropolitan Opera, I'm studying with my son. He produces a more piercing, a more beautiful voice than I. So I beg you, I ask of you, as I ask of my colleagues, to lose no opportunity to try to bring both halves of the brains of those who are responsible for guiding the educational programs in your communities, try to bring them together to recognize that music cannot be divorced from who we are. Even those of you who feel you cannot carry a tune in a bucket will, if you are honest with yourselves, admit that when you're in the shower and you've just received a raise, or when you're in the shower and you were denied a raise, that you will either hum something that might be identified as a joyful noise or the blues. You will return to your original language, the language of music. The power of words. Dennis asked me, in illustrating the use of the voice and the power of words, to share with you a little joke that I shared with him a number of months ago, and I sort of scratched my chin. I just wondered if, at the appropriateness of this to accomplish the purpose. But he assured me that I wouldn't be ridden out of here on a rail if I shared this little story with you. It seemed that on a given day, 4 gentlemen appeared at the pearly gates before St. Peter. An Englishman, an Italian, a Jew, and an African American. The Englishman approached the gates first, and St. Peter said, "Welcome, my son. Tell me a bit about your earthly experience." And the Englishman said,
"Well, you know, it's been very, very difficult during my life, you see, because we lost India. And then, you see, there was immigration, which changed the complexion of life here. And then, before I passed on, it was Hong Kong, you see. That was the last straw. It's been very difficult, and here I am."
and St. Peter said, "That's all right, my son. You have just one test to pass before you can be admitted here. Spell the word love."
Love? Oh, well, I say, that's not difficult at all. L-O-V-E.
"Welcome, my son."
Oh, thank you very much indeed.
The Italian was next. Said St. Peter, "My son, tell me a bit about your earthly journey."
Said, "Well, padre, è molto difficile di dire, perché it's very, very hard. You know, I live in a small town up in the Apennine, and it's just very hard to make a living off of the land. And my wife, she's, well, you know, we don't, it's just a larger family. I have just a lot of children and no money, you know. It's molto difficile, you know."
St. Peter said, "My son, all will be well. You have just one test. Spell the word love."
Oh, that's no problem. It's L-O-V-I, E-M-O-R-E, amore.
"Welcome, my son. Welcome to heaven." Next came the Jew. And St. Peter said, "Tell me a bit about your earthly journey." And the Jew said,
Well, I'm telling you, it's very difficult. You know, we had this terrible thing, the Second World War, and then I come to United States, and it's more of the same thing. People are always accusing me of my people of being the killer of Christ, and all. It's just terrible. It's just been extremely difficult all the way.
and St. Peter said, "Don't worry, my son. It will be fine. You have one test. Spell for me the word love."
Says, "Oi, that's no problem. L-O-V-E.
"Welcome, my son.
Welcome."
Next came the African American. "My son, tell me about your life in America."
Oh, man. Whoa. I mean, you understand what I'm saying? I mean, it's been hard, man. You know, get the worst jobs. I mean, you're the last hired man, you're the first fired. You know, they cut out welfare. They just take everything away from you, man. I mean, it's really been hard. You understand what I'm saying? And St. Peter said, "That's quite all right, my boy. Just you have one test. One test. Spell the word chrysanthemum." I don't know if that accomplishes your purpose or not, but did provide a bit of comic relief. We presented about 2 years ago a session on the African American spiritual and the German Lied, and we attempted to draw parallels between these two great expressions of musical art. One of the hallmarks of the music of Schubert, Schumann, Wolf, is the great honesty and simplicity with which it speaks. Yes, the music in its way is complex, but the result in the mouth of an artist is something so disarmingly simple that there are no barriers in the way to understanding. And the spiritual is much the same. Simple, direct, without artifice, speaking from the depths of the soul. One of the singers who was a model for me when I was growing up was the tenor Roland Hayes. Indeed, when I was a child singing in Detroit, I could receive no greater compliment than someone coming up to my parents and saying, "Oh, he's going to be another Roland Hayes." Well, there could never be another Roland Hayes. All that I or anyone else could hope to do would be to imitate the principles for which he stood as a man who sang with honesty from the depths of his soul. His arrangements of spirituals are on a par with the greatest writings of Franz Schubert. Simple but not simplistic. Powerful beyond explanation. And I would like to end my portion of this segment, before any questions that you might have to ask me, with a spiritual that was Hayes' signature. When I started my career as an opera singer and as a recitalist, I purposely eschewed the performance of spirituals for a number of years
Why? Because I knew everybody expected me to sing them. And I've taken great pride, I trust it's not false pride, but pride in not doing what people expect me to do, especially when it enters the realm of race. People expected me to be a blues singer, a jazz singer. So I purposely left spirituals off of my programs for a while, but I knew that I had to come back to them because it was great music. There was a cartoon drawn by the late E. Sims Campbell that I've never forgotten, which was published in the 1950s. It sort of illustrates visually what I'm talking about. The 50s were a time when the faculties of some universities in this country began to desegregate. And this cartoon shows a distinguished-looking black gentleman in a conference room at a university, and there are a number of white males at the table, and one of these gentlemen, who's evidently the chair of whatever committee this happens to be, is addressing the black gentleman who's standing there with a rather perplexed look on his face with a sheaf of papers in his hand. And the statement goes something like this. Now, Professor Jones, before you read us your paper on the effects of nuclear fission, blah, 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 how about a good old spiritual? So I decided, for a period of time at least, not to program spirituals on my recitals, but to do the music of Schubert, Puccini, Verdi, Brahms. But as I said, I had to come back to the spiritual because it's great music. The spiritual that I'll sing for you today, the one that became Roland Hayes' signature, is entitled Little Boy. And it depicts Jesus' meeting in the synagogue with the elders. My orchestra on this occasion is a lady who's not unknown to many of you, whose 10 musicians form one of the greatest orchestras in the country, Miss Sylvia Lee. Last night at the banquet, we were honored with impromptu performances by Matilda Dobbs, Shirley Verrett, and William Warfield. And Bill, before he got up to sing, said, "I'm going to do something that I tell my students never to do. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to sing for you without warming up." So.
I'm only 12 years been struck by thunder, and they decided while they wondered that all mankind must come under. Little boy, how old are you? Little boy, how old are you? Little boy, how old are you? Sir, I'm only 12 years old. The last time the little boy was seen, he was standing on Mount Olivet Green, and when he dispersed of the crowd, he entered up into a cloud. Little boy, how old are you? Little boy, how old are you? Little boy, how old are you? Sir, I'm only 12 years old.
Thank you very much. If any of you have any questions of me, I would be very happy to attempt to answer them. Oh, you want to take them later? I've been told that we'll take them later. Sorry about that. Thank you very much.
We're now going to take questions and discussion. I just want to introduce it this way, that at a meeting last night, Lyndon LaRouche said to a large group of people, including myself, I can't do my job if you don't do yours. I would like to keep, which includes you, I would like to keep the questions and discussion focused on the problems that Lynn raised in his address this afternoon, which has not always been the case at our conferences, but it's especially important now. Everybody has, I'm sure all of you, including me, have questions that you would like to have Lyndon LaRouche answer from your reading, from your private interests, from your scholarly studies, and so on and so forth. He is a universal intellect. He's a genius. He's certainly the only person in that category I've ever met and, frankly, ever expect to meet. And there are many things I would like to ask him and you would like to ask him, but I think now is not the time for it. We have a precious opportunity at this conference to deepen our grasp of the problems which he laid out this afternoon so that we can do our jobs over the next few weeks and months. We intend to have another conference in 6 months, but it's possible, if you heard what Lynn said this afternoon, that these issues of history will actually have been decided before our conference in 6 months, if indeed it takes place. So we have an opportunity now to concentrate our discussion on the problems which Lynn raised this afternoon, and that's what I think we should do. So people should ask their questions with that in view. Also, with that end in view, I will call on people out of turn where I think it's necessary or where Lynn says it's necessary in order to try to direct the discussion into the path which we need. So with that in mind, if you have questions, Charles Notley will take your name. He's right behind Harley, who's standing at the microphone. And the first question will be from Harley Schlanger, who's the leader of the labor committees in the Southwest of the United States.
Okay, Lynn, I was quite struck by the discussion you had this afternoon on the idea of the embedded in the U.S. Constitution, how it came forward with Lincoln, and how that affected the World War II generation, and then how that resonated again through FDR and was at the center of the civil rights movement. Now, of course, many baby boomers think that the civil rights movement was the victory of the baby boomers, the golden generation, and so on. And of course, we know that's not the case. But what's interesting to me is with the discussion you've had of the effect of the Truman Depression and the collapse of morality from the World War II generation coming home after the war to the immorality that created the baby boomers. And yet, it was your generation which was responsible for a moral reawakening with the civil rights movement. Now, as we look around today, there are many supporters of you and our movement who are somewhat cynical that we can move the baby boom generation and Generation X. But I think that having come through the McCarthy period, the Eisenhower administration, and then being mobilized for the civil rights movement gives some example of the kind of leadership. And given that this is the weekend of Dr. Martin Luther King and that you've spoken about this quite a bit, I wonder if you can take that to discuss a little bit this question of the kind of leadership that's required of us today.
As I said yesterday in the discussion of the same matter, that on the question of Christianity, which is what the issue is here, on the principles on which the United States was founded, that one should not speak according to what one is taught to say as doctrine. Above all, in such matters, one should speak the truth. And above all, to speak the truth, you must speak truthfully. You must not claim to know anything you don't know. And therefore, the fact that someone has taught you or you believe it is correct doctrine is no grounds for saying anything important on any important subject. If you learned it at college, it's not legitimate to say it, especially these days. Now, on the question of, is man made in the image of God? I can say with certainty that I know that. I can say with certainty that I know that every man and woman is made in the image of God. I can prove it. It's a scientific fact. Right? Now, therefore, the question is to understand the Constitution, you have to understand a number of people. Among the people most important to understand is Gottfried Leibniz, who, in a sense, was my mentor from my 14th year of age. Now, how do I know this? And I defy anybody to say the contrary, and I will say it's untrue. Because of what I described today, cognition. That cognition is a power which resides in every person if we develop it. Cognition is a power which every person has if they are developed. Cognition is associated with a passion, which Plato calls a passion for truth, which the Apostle Paul, in places such as 1 Corinthians 13, says if you are not of this passion, that everything else you pretend to believe or do is worthless. You are empty. You are tinkling brass. What is this passion? In Greek is called agape. In the language of Plato, in the language of Paul, also in the language of the Apostle John in his gospel. This is love. This is love of mankind. It is love of truth. It is love of justice. One's cause is that which makes the individual in the image of God. Therefore, it is impossible and immoral to teach students to learn. It is moral not to teach students to know. What they learn through cognition, they know. What they learn through words and textbooks and repetition and dutiful repetition of phrases, speak after me, they don't know. They have merely learned it. And if they say they know, they lie. And they lie above all to themselves as well as their friends. Therefore, I know all men are made in the image of God, because this power, which we recognize by a passion called in the Greek agape, is the power to discover the principles of the universe and more. And by that act of discovery, to command the universe, to obey us. Thus, when I read in Genesis first that man is made in the image of God, nothing about Adam and Eve there, man and woman are each made in the image of God to exert dominion over all living things, over this planet, over this universe. I know that's true. It's a fact of cognition. Thus, if man is of this nature, must we not have a society according to man's nature? And is it not evil to have anything in society which is contrary to man's nature? What is man's nature? Man is made in the image of God. Every baby is an angel made in the image of God with this power. It is an evil not to develop that power. It is an evil to drive that child into insanity, to oppress that child, to deprive it of nurture, to deprive it of the development of its cognitive powers, to cut it off from great art, to deprive it of a scientific education is a crime. It's a crime against humanity. And nobody loves humanity, and nobody is a Christian who denies that or allows that to occur. By this power, man rules the universe, and that is right, because this power is a godlike power. And therefore, must not society be constituted in such a way that society is provided the nurture, the assurance of the nurture, the education, the development of the cognitive powers of every child? And once we've educated the child, shall we put the child into slavery or degradation to make his suffering more acute precisely because he realizes that he's being abused? Must we not order society in such a way that it is fitting, a fitting place to live and work for the mission of that angel, which is the individual human being? Now, who knew this? Who wrote the Constitution? Well, a fellow called Gottfried Leibniz. And Gottfried Leibniz was the person who influenced, through Benjamin Franklin and his circle, who influenced and shaped the American Revolution. The most important works of Leibniz were against a man who was a true servant of the devil, John Locke. And these ideas that Leibniz expressed in this form, as they found themselves into the Declaration of Independence, were ideas that Leibniz wrote in denunciation of the evil intrinsic to British liberalism, that of the satanic John Locke. The life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Happiness is what? Happiness is agape. Happiness is joy in being human by expressing in the noblest degree that which is human. Happiness is seeing other people happy in this way. Is seeing joy, the light turn on in a blank face of a child. To see a child that seemed ignorant and dirty and helpless, and this child suddenly turns alive and comes alive and discovers something beautiful, science or art. That's happiness. Because you're only coming this way for one short time, and your happiness will have to be taken in how you perform your mission. As a good Samaritan in the larger sense. That is what the meaning is. Because remember, John Locke said life, liberty, and property. And property was the hallmark of slavery. John Locke was cited. John Locke was emblazoned in the Confederate Constitution. John Locke's life, liberty, and property were the defense of the peculiar institution, very peculiar, called slavery, on which the United States, by the way, lost money. The slave owners made money, the cotton manufacturers made money, but the United States lost money on it. It was not a profitable proposition, which makes it all the more evil because it was not done for profit, it was done for evil. Evil. The people who did it were not bad, misguided, they were evil. Now Lincoln was a student of these matters, and Lincoln, by the way, was also a student of William Shakespeare. His position papers to his cabinet were generally long quotations from William Shakespeare's dramas. And some of them used to complain loudly about that. But see, Lincoln was a genius, and he knew what Shakespeare was. Booth didn't. Booth was sort of a predecessor of Sir Laurence Olivier, the man who was the British imitator of, what's his name, this American actor, Mumbles, Marlon Brando, yeah, Mumbles Brando. So he understood that in Shakespeare, taking up these Greek tragic themes was precisely the knowledge of statecraft which his cabinet needed to understand what he was going to do. So Lincoln made this policy. He revived the American Constitution in exactly the way that Martin came to understand it, as Martin expressed it clearly. You see, in order to make each of us whole, we must make other people whole. In order to find our own humanity, we must give other people their humanity. That's what angels do. You're nothing but what you do in your mission. Your mission essentially is to contribute to humanity. Now, let's take the question, the last part of the question. What about the baby boomer? The characteristic feature of the baby boomer is they don't know what love is and they don't know what happiness is. It all comes out in the midlife crisis. They feel that their sexual potency is waning, their wife no longer attracts them, and they have a midlife crisis. Because they are creatures of pleasure, not happiness. Look at their entertainment. Look at the changes in entertainment in Europe and in the United States over the period of the past 30-odd years. We had a shift from a farce, an objet d'art, as just referred to by George, where art, instead of being something in which the population was involved as a participant, and the artist was a vehicle for evoking participation from the audience, it was an object to look at, to admire, to comment on. Look at the reviews. Look at the reviews from before 1966. In any newspaper, in virtually all newspapers. Read Musical America. Read any of these publications from that period. The art was never addressed. A comment on the art. It was like what color dress was worn to the opera by the singer. Something to that order. So we were tasters of culture, but at least we pretended to taste. Now they got bored with that after 1966, and Bob Dylan came in. And let me just describe a situation in 1968, September of 1968, which describes the situation perfectly. There's a fellow who some of us knew, Tony and I and others knew, who was a student at Columbia University, and I knew him from 1966-67 period. I knew him because I had written a pamphlet on third world issues called The Third Stage of Imperialism, which he was much attracted to at that point, and had approached me and engaged in an intelligent conversation on this subject. At a later point, he became part of the, or shall we say, he went to pot and took a trip through the acid route in between. And I saw him degenerate, and I attended a session in September of 1968, which he was addressing a typical Columbia student, undergraduate, graduate student audience. You wanted to say the Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel was completely coherent prose compared with this, what was going on there. This man was speaking in broken sentences, in garbled and mangled words at that. And he was getting cheers and all kinds of erotic exultation coming out of the audience. As far as I was concerned, there was no communication, about as much communication as walking a cage full of monkeys getting excited at the zoo. And yet they seemed to be pleased. Later I had an explanation. These were fragments from Bob Dylan something or others. And the very citation of little fragments from this garbage, this pig pen of language, would produce among the giggly types in the front row and so forth. But the characteristic of the baby boomer was an occupation, an obsession with pleasure. This obsession with pleasure came from their parents in a very peculiar way. The parents were, as you might suspect, of my generation. And the parents were typified by people with whom I've served in India and Burma during my overseas stint during World War II. And before we came back on the boat, and as we came back on the boat, we were pretty much of a pro-Roosevelt inclination. We had seen what the British did in their colonies. We had a smell of what happened to most of the people on this planet. And I proposed, and most people accepted the idea, that when we return to the United States, we should see to it the last vestiges of every damned empire on this planet ought to be eliminated while we in the United States had the power to do so. Just eliminate the empires. The British Empire, the French Empire, the Dutch Empire, the Portuguese Empire. Just cancel them out and give these countries what they wanted, a chance to have access to the opportunity for development which we prized for ourselves. And I can tell you that a majority of my fellow servicemen agreed. They were inspired, they were ennobled by what Roosevelt meant in the recovery of the United States from an appalling depression and getting through the war. They came back off the boat in what I thought would be reasonably good moral condition. But within a year to two after that, I discovered the quite contrary. Truman turned the American servicemen into animals, and he had already succeeded with their wives. What had happened is remember that Roosevelt was determined to eliminate imperialism. The British turned it around with Truman, and Truman loved the British. He was a man of poor taste, you know. And so, therefore, we gave the British back their empire. The British got us to give the French back their empire. The Portuguese were given their empire. The Dutch were given their empire back. And we said, the big issue was Russia. So Stalin was over there, not thinking about any war, but they whomped up a good threat against the Soviet Union, and Stalin turned into a raving character. Now the big enemy is communism. So now we ally with our enemy, our age-old enemy, the Brits. And I can tell you, my fellow American, and I went to visit, the course of post-war period, old buddies and so forth, to see many of the people I served with overseas. And they had turned into animals, and their wives were worse. Don't get into trouble. Don't say what you think. Don't do what you think. We lost 5 years in the war to make up for it. We've got to build this family. We've got to get security. We've got to get that job. We've got to get this. Don't get into trouble. Don't think that. Don't say that. Don't be associated with that. They became totally immoral pigs because what they said was not premised upon what they believed to be true or truthful. It was not premised on a sense of justice. It was not premised on reality. It was premised upon that sewer pipe that leads to the cesspool of history called mainstream thinking. These were the parents of the baby boomer generation. This was the culture these families represented, especially those who sent their children to universities in the 1960s. So don't be surprised the way the baby boomers turned out on the crisis of the missile crisis. Yeah? Some of you remember what the missile crisis was like those weeks. There were a lot of lies were told about that, by the way, that should be cleaned up in due course. We've got the documentation now. The lies can be proven. The British set up Khrushchev in this one against the United States. Our dear old ever-loving British allies, typical of them. Well, that. The shooting of Kennedy and the cover-up, and the smell of the cover-up was all over the place. People say conspiracy theory. These people are degenerates. No conspiracy theory. The facts were there. Somebody killed the president. It wasn't one guy with a pop gun. It didn't shoot straight. And there were issues involved, important issues of the highest strategic significance in eliminating Kennedy, a job done by the same people who tried to eliminate de Gaulle. Yeah? The same people, same collection of people who are running that terrorist operation in Chiapas State in Mexico today. Yeah? Same crowd. The same people who created the Sendero Luminoso terrorists in Brazil and in Peru, the narco terrorists. Right? So they took these pretty children who came from families who had abandoned truthfulness, who had abandoned justice, abandoned morality for the sake of being part of the mainstream that leads to the cesspool. So these children were subjected to a shock, and they had no inner moral strength. They believed in nothing because they didn't want to believe in anything. They wished to induce themselves to be perceived believing in what was considered advantageous. What we produced was a bunch of children who pretended to believe, but who believed precisely nothing, except in success and security and avoiding trouble, like drafts, like strong, cold, or hot drafts that might lead to Vietnam. You know? That's what we produced. We produced people who were essentially hedonists, pleasure seekers, opportunists who would do anything to get in the mainstream, to get the brass ring on the mainstream sewer ride. And you wondered why they were so easily brainwashed? You had people changing their sex every morning on campuses in the middle of the 1960s. I mean, they were changing everything. There was no morality. The popular culture was cultural relativism, social relativism, moral relativism. They didn't study anything. They didn't learn. They didn't know anything. They wouldn't go through the experience of knowing. They would learn. They would go to the library, read a book, get a text. That's knowledge. The book's a lie. How's that knowledge? It's carnal knowledge of a book. So the problem here is you have a generation, the baby boomer generation, which includes our president. Our president's major political problem is that he's a baby boomer. If you understand the baby boomer problem and you look at every mistake, every blunder the president makes, there's no other political motive for it but his fact that he's proud of being a baby boomer. He thinks of his generation as the golden generation. It was our generation who were revived by Kennedy because he became president. We were revived with optimism, and that was the impetus that carried the civil rights movement forward. The civil rights movement began to die in 1964. It died because the Ford Foundation, other foundations, took over and tried to split the civil rights movement. As long as Martin was alive, Martin knew how to handle the problem. He insisted on nonviolence in the movement in order to keep under control those who wanted to use violence as a method, those who were usually on the payroll of various foundations. Martin understood the power of love. Martin understood the power of truth. Martin understood that you had to give the African American a mission. The very poor, they were poor people mostly. They were have-nots mostly. What do you get a have-not to give? But they gave. They gave the opportunity because Martin loved them. Martin gave them identity. Martin made them angels who were coming through a slum, a dump, into a place where people were rallying and said, we have a mission. We are going to change this nation into what it must become. It was Martin. Love. Now, there are two lessons to be learned from that. One is the baby boomer won't admit it, but the baby boomer is a miserable creature. And their children are more miserable than they are. The baby boomer is a miserable existentialist stuck in a swamp of history. The Generation Xer doesn't know where the swamp is located. They're miserable people. They have nothing. They have no happiness. They have no joy. They have no beauty. What do they look at? Sex, violence, gore. That's their entertainment, pleasure, sadomasochistic hedonism. They don't have happiness. How do you deal with the people like that? My recipe is you have to love them. And you have to say, well, Christ had to deal with some pretty bad characters himself, didn't he? And the only solution is you have to love them. And you have to bring them to an understanding of happiness. And you have to use the shock when everything in which they thought they believed, all this paper mache, all this glitter, all this all-night techno dancing, whatever else it is, it doesn't work anymore. The lights go off for the techno joint because the power is shut off. And they have to bring in a substitute act. There's Madeleine Albright. Fortunately, she has the decency to keep her clothes on. Or they'd all pass out. Huh? In any case, so that's the point. Yes, we can reach these guys, but you have to have, first number, you have to understand these are human beings. They're not in very good condition. The crate was opened. The contents were heavily contaminated. They were delivered at your door in terrible condition. They stank. They hadn't been bathed in a long time. But they're yours. And the first thing you have to do is you have to give them some motivation. And the motivation is not money. The motivation is not pleasure. They've had too much of that. The motivation is happiness. The motivation is the joy of a childlike joy in making a discovery which is an act of cognition, which gives them a sense of beauty. Drama, classical art forms, science, teach them. Give them a sense of joy. Give them a sense that it is important to be themselves, that there's something beautiful inside them. People will not fight in this time for money. They won't fight for this objective. They're not going to fight for this practical program, that practical program, because they're draft dodgers. They don't fight. They steal, but they don't fight. Huh? What you have to do is give them human character by evoking it from within them, awakening it. And that's what we have to do. You have to love them. But to love a person is not the kind of tough love they talk about at the IMF, but the other kind. We don't put up with any nonsense. But we want the best for you. And that'll work.
Next question is from Laura Smith from Chicago.
My name is Laurel Smith, and I waited 6 months to ask this question. The last time I was here, I had to do a lot of research and reformat from Chicago chapter. My question is on the Riemannian surfaces. He shows the spark of light in man, or the spark of reason, the creation of man in God's image. My question is, if we say man was made in God's image, and if we believe this, that God's image is a spheroid, or a sphere, exerting a pressure on the 9 planets by a conical value of Hertz frequencies. If we believe God's image is light, and it's a spherical radiation of light that the planets harmonize off of on a conical value by the golden section, when we say the microcosm is a measure of the macrocosm, if everything is ordered on harmonics and frequencies, could we then look at the Riemannian surfaces and see a single connected surface or a doubly connected surface as a preprotozoan? And if so, how can we find God's measurement in man dealing with cells and circles like the planets are spheres and circles?
What you have to do is you have to keep away from that textbook stuff. First of all, because they do a lot of double talking in those textbooks, in those explanations, and to mislead you as to what it's all about. Look, I presented the essence of the matter, what is a Riemannian hypergeometry or modular geometry today. If I say you're standing on the earth and you're trying to observe what you believe to be the passage of the sun from sunrise to sunset, and you believe that this portrays a circular orbit of the sun around the earth, or conversely, you're a little smarter and say what it could mean, the earth is rotating and the sun is relatively fixed. Then I introduce a second consideration, a second curve. Remember, the first curve is a circular curve of a circular orbit. But I'm standing on a position which is in orbit too. So not only is the earth rotating, but the time it's rotating, it's also moving along the elliptical orbit around the sun. So there's a little bit of motion in this direction while there's motion in that direction. At the same moment, the earth is also precessing in such a way as to conform to the progress of the equinoctial succession. So it's also moving in that direction. It's also what's happening at the same time. We want to throw some other things in. The north pole of the earth is moving in its position, relative geographic position on the earth. At the same time, the north geographic pole is moving, the north magnetic pole is moving. And this involves cycles of approximately 2,000 years. Another 25,200 years. Then the cycles of the earth around the sun, the orbit of the earth around the sun itself moves. And this results in what we call ice ages. All this stuff about global warming and global cooling, it's all nonsense. It's all determined in astrophysics, has nothing to do with carbon dioxide. As a matter of fact, you get more carbon dioxide into the planet atmosphere, you will cool the planet, because plants, given sunlight and carbon dioxide and a little water, they just sit there, ooh, and they gobble it up and they make more plant. And the plant absorbs sunlight and cools the planet. You want to make a desert cool? Put a lot of carbon dioxide and water over the desert and plant some seeds. Watch the desert turn green and watch it turn cool at night. You want to make the southern Deccan province of India, part of India, cool? Plant trees. Bring more carbon dioxide in there. It'll make the plants very happy. They love water, sunlight, and carbon dioxide, and a few mineral traces from the soil and things like that as well. So these cycles include this 100,000-year cycle, and then there are a lot of other ones as well. You have the cycle of the sun changes its radiation. The biggest effect on temperature on Earth is the sun that periodically, boom, pulses out a lot of radiation. Not only does electromagnetic radiation in the normal sense, but also gravity waves. We have a dear friend of ours, Maurice Allais, who's written some papers we're working on publishing, which deal with this problem of gravity, the gravity of the situation, shall we say. So all of these things enter into this. Now, so therefore, in knowing the real universe, what you find is that in the process of discovery, we keep finding new cycles. And I referred this afternoon to the cycle of the longitudinal force in electrodynamics, which is discovered by Ampere and then proven by Wilhelm Weber. Another cycle This world, universe, is full of cycles. Every cycle is interacting with every other cycle. If you look at Gauss, where this is laid out, you'll see that. If you read Leibniz in the latter part of the 17th century on the further development of the calculus after his 1776 paper on the subject, you find the exposition of exactly this problem, which is then developed by Gauss, which is called modular physical geometry or hypergeometry. Then this undergoes a slight transformation and is somewhat more complicated and simplified by Bernhard Riemann. But it's all the same thing. So there is no simple mumbo-jumbo with mathematical or geometric figures. This is all the fact that the universe is composed of all kinds of principles, each of which is associated with something like a cycle. All these principles are acting upon each other at every time. So therefore, in the microcosm, that is in the infinitesimally small, there is never linearity. In other words, you can never use the engineer's calculus to try to understand the universe. You can never use classroom mathematics as it's ordinarily taught. You can't understand the universe. That's perfectly good for engineering work where the principles are established in order to simplify calculations. But for scientific purposes, never use a mathematics based on the assumption that the universe is linear in the infinitely small or infinitesimally small. It isn't. The smaller it gets, the more complex the universe becomes. That's the microcosm. Now, the interesting thing is us. See, we are also a principle. We're in this universe. And we not only can learn all these other principles, learn their interaction, detect them in the small, prove their existence, discover the implications in the large of these things in the small, but this is all done by our mind, by the power of cognition. This power of cognition enables us to master these principles in the universe. Now, how many watts does a thought take? It's a very small amount of work, isn't it? Who knows how small? So this little small thing, this little microcosm, this monad, which is what Leibniz calls it, this monad is able to act upon all of these complex cycles in the universe, as with John Glenn going into space. He's doing that in a sense. He may not appreciate fully what he's doing, but he's not totally stupid. And then masters the universe. This mind, this little thought, this act of cognition is the most powerful force in the universe. And God so designed the universe. So there really no mumbo-jumbo is necessary, no arcana, no Gnostic mysticism. No, it's all perfectly comprehensible, which is why I introduced that today, not to explain the whole thing, but simply to demystify. Get it out of all these crazy lying textbooks and mumbo-jumbo. You have professors who try to pretend to know what they're talking about. They don't. They write textbooks instead. And then they have students who give lectures on the subject. So no mumbo-jumbo. This is all perfectly comprehensible. And the secret is the student studying the cycles and studying how the universe works. And being happy while doing it.
Next question is from Scott Alsop of Dallas. Is he here?
He's making it to the microphone.
Okay, good.
You may have partially answered this with Harley's question earlier, but I know how the organization likes to look back, reflect on history, and pick out the good things that have been done in the past and recreate those. My question deals with, earlier today you mentioned that in the 1800s during the Lincoln administration that was our best opportunity for economic development and growth. Also, this could also apply to like maybe the Roosevelt and Kennedy administrations or whatever, but I like to stick with the Lincoln example, but what was it? Was there something that caused the paradigm shift in the way the public in general thought that made them discover, hey, we've been electing the wrong type of people now, should we elect the, let's make a change and elect the right type of person? Because, for example, today, if you put a good candidate in front of people, since they've been educated by the boob tube and whatever, they still wouldn't vote for the good candidate. You've proved that many times yourself. But, what dynamic was in the workings to cause people to wake up and say, hey, we need to do this?
Just break it down without, I could go long on this one, but let's keep it under control here. First of all, you got two parts to the question. First of all is, what was the nature of what the Lincoln-Kerry program in its 1861-1876 phase? The significance of 1876 is this was the great centennial celebration of the American Revolution Declaration of Independence, which is an international festival in which the accomplishments of the United States in economy and technology were featured at the Philadelphia Fair. This coincided with the first efforts by the enemies of the United States from within to destroy the United States system, beginning 1873 with the bankrupting of Jay Cooke, in order to bring the United States back under the control of the London bankers and their New York City and New England stooges. So therefore, 1876 is a turning point which represents the cumulative high point of a period of development of about 15 years of economy, despite efforts already in place to disrupt it. Sometimes the product is finished after the plant is about to be shut down, this sort of thing. So that this model of the American system, the 1876 model, was adopted by Germany, that is by the national economy faction in Germany. It was adopted by Bismarck shortly after that, who changed his policy, who introduced a social welfare policy into Germany as part of this and broke with the British. It was introduced into Russia through the scientist Mendeleev, who is the great railroad builder and the great developer of many industries in Russia, together with his friends, including his friend, a younger man, Graf Sergei Witte, finance minister and for a time a prime minister of Russia, who was eliminated by the British with the 1905 revolution and things like that. And Russia was rearmed afterward, but was only rearmed with British and French support, especially French support, after 1907, 1908, in order to build up Russia for war against Germany. Because Russia had become, after the 1905 revolution, a complete tool of the Anglo-French forces in a conspiracy to destroy Germany. And up to that time, remember, up until 1898 approximately, and in this period, 1894, Japan broke with the United States with the Sino-Japanese War and went over to the British side totally. And Japan was an enemy of the United States from 1894 until the end of World War II. As a matter of fact, the attack on Pearl Harbor was originally planned by the British and Japanese together in the early 1920s, when the British and the Japanese were planning to conduct a war against the United States in the context of the naval power treaty agreements, the so-called Locarno, etc. business. But in that period, from the Lincoln period, the victory in the Civil War, until approximately the end of the 19th century, the allies of the United States were or became Russia. We had no allies before then, none. We had only one thing, we had the Bay of Tunis. And the United States had an alliance with the Tunisians against the Barbary pirates early in the 19th century. I was our only ally from about 1793, 1789, our only ally until the 1850s. And our first important ally came in the 1850s in terms of Russia. Alexander II of Russia. We were isolated. So from the victory in the Civil War established the United States, beginning at this development, leading into 76, as the leading economic power in the world. In the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, the United States was the leading military power in the world. The United States was technologically the most advanced nation in the world. All of these good things. And a lot of people say, hey, this is a great model, let's work with this. Among the first to join the United States was Japan. The Meiji Restoration was a result of the United States' success in influencing the Japanese to imitate the United States. And Henry Carey sent E. Peshine Smith, one of his students, to Japan as consultant to the Meiji Restoration in order to design the industrial economy of Japan. What? He was education. Yeah, right. Yeah. Then you had Russia, of course, was an ally of the United States. Germany was an ally of the United States, especially after 1876. France became an ally of the United States. It had been the enemy of the United States, the British ally and the enemy of the United States, until Napoleon III was sent into the ash can, or back to Britain, which is pretty much the same thing. And it remained an ally of the United States until 1898, when it went over back to the other side, back to the British side. So this is this period. Now, what happened in this period? The problem is that because of the isolation of the United States, that every power in Europe, every power of the Holy Alliance, every nation in South and Central America which was allied with the Holy Alliance, plus Britain, plus Russia, which is part of the Holy Alliance, were enemies of the United States. We had, except for the Bay of Tunis, we had no allies outside the United States. None. Though we had friends in Mexico, like the movement in Mexico, which were called the Protectionists, which were tied to John Quincy Adams. We had movements in Colombia, connected through the American system through Germany, and things like that. So we had many movements in Ibero-America in the early 19th century, which tend to be wiped out, which were allied to the United States as a cause in the early 19th century. Many of these either directly through the United States, as in the case of the Mexican protectionist movement, which is directly connected to John Quincy Adams, or movements such as that in Colombia, which is the German movement, which was connected to the Republican Socialist movement later in Germany. So we were destroyed virtually. Jefferson and Madison were administrations which were under British control. Now, Jefferson was not a traitor, but Jefferson was a confused mind. He was sort of the Bill Clinton of his age. William Jefferson Clinton, I suppose that has, right? And as long as he was working with Franklin and under Franklin's influence, Jefferson's positive side came out, though basically he was a Lockean. But once Franklin was dead, and he came under some perverse French influences, French philosophical influences, he became a confused mind. He returned somewhat to himself in his last years. But as president, he was a disaster. He was just less a disaster than the outright traitor Aaron Burr. Madison had foisted upon him, as Tony Chaikin would explain to anybody who needs to know, had foisted upon him a dolly. Now, men should not play with dollies, particularly older men. And Dolly was a creature of Aaron Burr. The key guy was Albert Gallatin, who was a British agent, who was Secretary of Treasury, and the United States adopted a free trade policy, somewhat like that which Newt Gingrich likes during the administrations of Jefferson and Madison. So that was a disaster. Then we had a patriot came back to power, partly because Dolly, when the British were invading Washington, Dolly grabbed her husband, who was really her Dolly, and dragged him off somewhere in Virginia to hide. And Monroe stayed on post in Washington and defended Washington and became the President of the United States and restored the United States to its dignities. He was succeeded by John Quincy Adams, who was probably the greatest genius the United States had in politics at any one point. And he was the center of this sort of thing for the United States. But during this period, we had friends in Europe, but they weren't in power. Our friends in Europe included the circles of Lazacano, of the École Polytechnique. They included circles in Germany, the Schiller circles in Germany, yeah, and things of that sort. Among the benefits we had from Europe was in 1814, some people fled France on the French Bourbon Restoration, which is the Holy Alliance Restoration, the British Restoration, and went to the United States and went to West Point and worked with Commandant Sylvanus Thayer in the rebuilding of West Point after the War of 1812. West Point became the center of science and engineering in the United States during that period. And from that, we got the Corps of Engineers. The Corps of Engineers, as provided by the École Polytechnique, was based on the work of Monge and his associates in science, and was based on the work of Lazare Carnot, who was the inventor of the principle of machine tool design. It was Lazare Carnot, in about 1.5 to 2 years of his influence over French military policy, who applied the machine tool design principle to the conduct and logistics of warfare. He was the first developer of mass production. It was one of his, for example, his mass production within 1.5 years of French mobile field artillery changed the character of warfare, among other things that he did. So the United States developed an engineering capability, including a machine tool design capability, centered around West Point and associated with the U.S. Corps of Engineers. And so the Patriots continued. Benjamin Franklin's great-grandson was a key figure in this operation, directly working with Gauss and with Alexander von Humboldt in Germany, so that after that period, French science was the original science of the United States. After that, German science, the science of Gauss, Alexander von Humboldt, became American science. The U.S. Coast and Geodetic Survey was an offshoot of the work of Karl Gauss from Germany, for example. So that then we had a bunch of bums. We had outright traitors. Andrew Jackson. His controller, a London controller, Manhattan banker, Martin Van Buren. We had Polk, another British agent, a real pig against whom John Quincy Adams fought his last battle, and Lincoln fought one of his first important battles. You had outright traitors, Franklin Pierce, James Buchanan. These were all free traders, just like Newt Gingrich, just like the John Birch Society. All free traders. And they ruined the United States. They were for free trade, no protection of industry. Well, time came. Conflict was developed in the United States, not about slavery. The conflict was simple. The British were determined to destroy the United States. Their method was to break it up into several parts. The British had three assets in the United States. The New England Yankee opium trader families, the ancestors of McGeorge Bundy. The New York bankers, which included people like Aaron Burr, who was a British agent, an agent directly of British intelligence, British foreign intelligence, and of Barings Bank. You had people like Van Buren, a British agent, who destroyed our credit system through his stooge, who developed the so-called land bank scheme and destroyed this national banking. Some idiots think that somehow Jackson was a populist. He was a populist, but he was like most populists. He was an idiot. And he's a hero because he opposed the bankers. What bankers did he oppose? The patriotic bankers in favor of the British bankers. 1837, we had the panic, almost destroyed the United States. Then we had in the 1850s, 1840s, we had Polk, almost destroyed the United States, betrayed the United States, a British agent. Pierce, a British agent. August Belmont, a British agent. The Morgan interests, British agents. And we had the Southern slave owners. These three layers have been the curse of the United States. All right, so what the plan was, the British plan was to start a war between two allies. Remember, the New England slave abolitionists and the Southern slave owners were members of the same faction. The idea was to create an issue. The New England abolitionists produced textiles with slave-produced cotton. The Lowells in that crowd. Right? Pigs. Now, the idea was to divide the United States into several parts. The same idea which Prince Philip recently proposed in Washington, D.C., the dismemberment of the United States into several parts, is a part of environmentalism, ecology, or something. Right? The Confederacy plot was a plot to get a war started between the secessionist Confederacy and other parts of the United States in order to a peace agreement of which McClellan, General McClellan was a part, George McClellan, a peace agreement to establish the recognition of the independence of the Confederacy, which would result in the dismemberment of the United States into a bunch of warring baronies. And Beaumont says so in his letter. And he was the controlling agent. He controlled the Democratic Party. So you think we got problems in the Democratic Party now? We had it then too. August Belmont, who controlled the Democratic Party, was a traitor and a British agent, and so was George McClellan. George McClellan refused to win battles when he could because he was for a separate peace to recognize the secession. So he would fight to defend Washington, but he wouldn't fight to destroy Lee's army when he could. Those are the conditions. So suddenly, a crisis erupts. And through a combination of forces, Lincoln, who represents the opposition to this, comes to power. And Lincoln does something which Bill Clinton would never understand. He set out to win a war. Right? He said, we must defend the Union. Why? You can't fight against slavery unless you create the instrument that destroys slavery. You must destroy slavery on the continent. How do you do that? By crushing the institution which represents slavery and establishing the institution which prohibits it. And that great amendment, which is the Lincoln Amendment of the Constitution, exemplifies this policy. You cannot win a war without a victory. To win a victory, you must create an institution, an army. You must win the victory and institutionalize the victory. That's how you make reforms. And Lincoln understood that. So what did we do? What we did was what we knew. What we did is we mobilized to win total war, as Lazare Carnot had done. The trouble was finding some honest generals to fight the war. Lincoln launched what? Lazare Carnot's machine tool design principle. We introduced machine tool design industry and machine tool design methods to effect, through science, which was largely French and German science, to a revolution in technology. The war was not won by the soldiers, though they played their part. The war was not won by the generals, though Grant and especially Sherman were geniuses. And Sheridan wasn't so bad. The war was won in industry. The war was won in logistics and science and technology. The war was won by creating an instrument, a United States as a powerful armed economy which could destroy the enemy. The Confederacy was doomed, not because we had better generals, though we did, in the end we did. The Confederacy was doomed because the United States was a superior armed agency determined to win a war against an inferior, immoral, degenerate institution, the Confederacy. And so from this, with protectionist methods and with repeal of the free market, and with a president who was prepared to make war on Britain and invade Canada and so forth if necessary, we established a really serious economy on this continent. And every nation in this planet which was serious about serious economy had no choice but to turn to the American system for that. Now, we got after that as a result of the creeping in of treason, particularly after the Tilden Hayes scandal and things of that sort, which are a whole subject in themselves. We got a dominant role through London, through the Specie Resumption Act, by a corrupt Congress. An act was passed which destroyed the sovereignty of the United States in respect to its own currency. And through that, the London forces and their agents inside the United States grabbed control of the financial apparatus of the United States and took control of industry through finance. The fight between Wall Street and Ford merely typifies what this struggle was about. So we began a dual system of financier oligarchy on top, especially after Teddy Roosevelt became president. But that's what Grover Cleveland already represented. And national economy underneath. As long as we were threatened with a war, and as long as the military still had people like MacArthur in it, people who were Civil War generals like,
Leesburg National Center Chorus. The work that they're going to present to you is the fruit of work that they do every morning, about 10 minutes or so of work every morning. We found that the best way to begin the day was with beauty. And I suggest that everyone strive for this. The piece that we're going to do first is we're going to do a short little warm-up piece. And then we're going to launch into 3 sections of Mozart's Requiem. I do not want to detract from the profound impression that this piece has on the human heart by going through the many wonderful and fascinating details of the way that Mozart constructed this piece. Suffice it to say that it was based on a creative breakthrough. And I will simply point out 2 aspects of that breakthrough in terms of the way he sets it up. The first is the way he uses what is termed inversion, where a small statement is taken and turned in a different way, turned upside down, turned backwards, and in this way a problem or a paradox is created in a simple form. Rather than showing you that with Mozart's piece, what I decided to do is to take a shorter piece that we also use every morning in a warm-up, a piece written by J.S. Bach, which is specifically based just on inversions. And let me demonstrate the way that will work. First, what I will have is the sopranos simply sing the opening of the little canon. So you hear that. You play Soldo? That is repeated by all of the other voices, but not at the same time. It's done in polyphony, and each voice successively enters and does the same thing on a different, but from a different starting point. Just to give you one example, let me have the altos do their line just a little bit. Now we will do all 4. But that's not all. Now let's turn this little idea upside down. Let's hear the basses sing the same thing upside down. Now we'll put that together. With the Requiem, I simply want to point out one aspect, which you will notice in all of the work. I simply want to point out the way that the opening works in the Requiem. Requiem, by the way, means rest in peace. This is a Requiem for the dead. However, Mozart's Requiem is very, very much for the living. The way it starts... Marcia, could you please play just the opening line there? Oh. Okay. That's fine. Okay. The opening, you notice that there's an pa, and then the next the other voice enters. It goes pa, dum, like that. Play that again. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Mozart could have written that simply with pa on the downbeat. Try that just on the downbeat. He didn't do that. The shift is very similar to the shift between the two statues that Lyndon LaRouche showed in his presentation. On the left-hand side, the pre-classical, which was stiff and straight. And on the right-hand side, the one with the shift, where everything is off balance. And that's precisely the nature of Mozart's breakthrough in this piece. Now, since we don't have an orchestra, and since the opening of this piece is very important for the whole thing, and we were frustrated because we wanted to hear the orchestra, we decided to become the orchestra. And so I taught the chorus the opening parts, which were written for 2 basset horns, those are low clarinets, and 2 bassoons. But instead, what we're going to have that done is by the sopranos, altos, tenors, and basses. The entire piece is encapsulated in these few short measures. And I hope just by singing these, you can at least get some idea of the passion behind the breakthrough that Mozart made when he did this piece, which it was the last piece he wrote. And of course, he did not even complete it. He wrote it. He died in the middle of composing it. So let us do this opening passage, and then what I will do is we'll start over again with just the orchestra, and we will sing the whole Requiem section. And then after that, we're going to sing 2 other selections. One is the Lacrimosa, and the third one is the Sanctus.
Maddie, Distinguished University Professor of Music at the University of Michigan School of Music.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be with you. I've just finished 3 days of seeming non-stop activity with the National Opera Association convention here in Washington over the Marriott. So if I appear a bit brain dead, please forgive me. The introduction made it appear, at least to me, as though I had some expertise in composition. Nothing could be further from the truth. I've spent my life as a singer of other people's compositions, and it's in that capacity and as a music educator that I come before you this evening. In part to plead for the continuance of music education in the public schools